Hey everybody, it's Courtney. I am back with another video for Not Too Shabby. Again, using the Oh My Whiskers stamp set by Honeybee Stamps. We're going to be making 4 cards total this month with this stamp set. This is card number 2. So I'm starting off with a piece of Arteza watercolor paper here, and I'm just saturating the paper with clean water. And I'm bringing out my Arteza watercolors here, just using a light blue and a purple, I believe it's lavender. And I'm just dropping in a teeny tiny bit of color and letting that water kind of spread that color out. It will be very muted. I just wanted a little bit of color in the background. I let this air dry. You can certainly use a heat gun to speed up the process. And I forgot to press record in this part, but all I did was stamp the 2 images, this main one and this little butterfly. And I stamped with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. And I'm bringing out the Arteza watercolor pencils. Now, I'm very, very new to these. This is actually the first time I'm using them in a project. So this is going to be a lot of experimenting here. So I went in with that charcoal and I just went in on this little bucket here on either side. Because this is a round object, we would have a center highlight. So once I had the color down with the pencil, I'm going in with a clean damp brush, starting off in the center and working my way towards that color, towards the area where we put down that pencil. I did have to work it a little bit because I just don't think I put down enough. Like I said, I'm new to this, so this is just like, learning as we go. Going to use that same gray color for this little kitty here, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading because I want this kitty to appear either really light gray or even white, but we do have that background, so we need to add a little bit of color to him or else he's going to be blue and purple like the background is. Again, just laid down the pencil in those darkest areas and used a damp brush to kind of spread that out. Same thing for this little kitty, just bringing out a different color here. Now you'll notice that when I dip my paintbrush into the water, I'm dabbing off onto a paper towel. So my paintbrush is not soaking wet, but I have to say that I am adding a little bit more water than I normally would for other watercoloring mediums, such as traditional watercolors or real brush pens. I typically use a minimal amount of water. Here I am using a little bit more just to get those colors to spread. Here I'm just going to add a little bit of ground for my little objects to be on. So I'm just going to go in with a brown pencil here, pretty much just go along the edge of the image and then come up from the bottom of the card panel with that damp brush, or actually it's pretty wet, and bring that up to where that pigment is and kind of just let that spread. Now the watercolor pencils are not going to spread as much as traditional watercolor, which is why I'm using more color, or more water rather, and kind of working in certain areas a little bit more than others to get that color to blend. You can also use 2 or 3 or 4 different pencils in one particular image, but for right now I'm working in pretty small areas, so I'm only concentrating on using one color. Once I get to this little rain boot here, you'll see that I'll use 2 different pencils. For these flowers here, I'm just going to add a little bit of color to the base of each of the petals, then come in with that damp paintbrush, starting off on the edge of the petals, or the ends or tips of the petals, and working my way down to the center. Same thing for this little daisy, I guess. Well, that's the way I'm coloring it. Just adding a little bit of that yellow to the base of the petals and kind of bringing that out with the damp paintbrush. I am skipping the middle of this flower for right now, just because I don't want to work in 2 areas that are touching that are still wet, because my colors will blend where I don't want them to blend. I didn't see that much of a problem with the watercolor pencils as I would with if you were using distress inks or distress oxides or any other watercolor medium. I just didn't notice them meshing together as much, but you would still have that issue. For these little leaves, I'm going to use 2 different greens. For these really teeny tiny ones, I'm really just putting a dot of color and blending that out just to kind of soften it. You don't really have to do any blending. These are so teeny tiny, but I want the texture, I guess, to match the rest of the card. So I am blending them out just to kind of soften those areas out. I'll bring in a different green for these larger leaves, but again, even though they're a little bit larger than these, they're still pretty teeny tiny. I'm just using the water just simply to soften those areas out. Now for the, I know I'm kind of skipping ahead here, but for the centers of the flowers, I started off with a really pale orangish color. And for the pink flower, it worked out well, but for the yellow flower, it kind of blended in a little bit too much. So I ended up bringing in a darker orange, and I think it's actually called orange. And I went directly over the center of that yellow flower, even though it was still wet. So I'm not going to get a variation of color because it kind of just spread immediately, but at least it kind of darkened it up. And you can do wet or dry, I guess, dry on wet, dry pencil on wet paper, and you will have those areas kind of blend and spread. So next I'm going to move on to this boot here. And no, I lie. First, I'm going to add a little bit more color to this brown cat. He just wasn't getting enough contrast and he just wasn't dark enough for me. So I just added a little bit of that cinnamon again in those same areas. You will want to make sure that it is dry before you go back and add any more color for a larger area like this. For the smaller areas, I don't seem to have a problem, but for the larger ones, I definitely did, and you want to make sure that those areas are dry. I'm going to just add a little bit of pink to this white cat's ears, and now we will move on to the boot. So I'm going to start off with this first color here, and again, I'm going to keep a center highlight because the boot is a round object, especially on the ankle area, which is the area that we're going to work on first. So I'm going to go in with a really light hand and just add a little bit of color to each of the sides of the boot. Then I'm going to bring in another color here, which is a little bit darker, and I'm going to add a little bit less of this, and I'm just going along the outer edges of the boot and where the sections, I guess, of the boot meet. That would also create a shadow there. Again, going in with that damp paintbrush, starting in the center and working my way towards that pigment. Like I said, this is a really large area, so I did have to work at it just a little bit. And I think this will just come with practice, knowing how much pigment I have to put down before going in with my water. Just not used to it yet, but I will keep practicing because these are kind of fun to work with. So I didn't want to right away work on the bottom portion of the boot just because the top is still wet and I didn't want to have those areas mesh too much. So I'm going to move on to the butterfly. I'm just adding a little bit of color to the base of his wings where it meets the butterfly's body, I guess. And again, damp paintbrush starting with the tips of the wings, working my way towards the middle. I'm not really worried about these two areas touching, still being wet because I'm using the same color. I'm not adding a whole lot of colors to this teeny tiny butterfly. So next we'll move on to the bottom portion of this boot, and pretty much going to do the shading the same way as I did for the top, using those same two colors, adding a little bit more of the lighter color and just concentrating the darkest color being in the very darkest areas. Again, there's going to be shading off to the left-hand side because this boot is kind of like tilted out a little bit towards the right. So more shading would be off to the left. Also, there is a little line within the illustration where the toe portion of the boot would kind of be raised up. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and add a little bit of shading there as well. Going in with that damp paintbrush into that blank area and working my way out to the pigment. There is a couple of areas that I did go back and add a little bit more to, especially the sole of the boot. For some reason, I just couldn't get that to look right. I kind of went back and forth with that particular area a couple of times. I added a little bit more pink to this other cat's ears now that he was completely dry and just blended that out a little bit with a damp paintbrush. Here's where I'm going to go back and add a little bit more color to the sole of the boot. I got that a little bit wet and then added a little bit of color where it's kind of bent. I guess it would be, I think they call that the ball of your foot, I think, where that would be anyway, because that's kind of indented. So I just added a little bit of shading there. I did go out of the lines a little bit right on that side of the boot. I added some clean water, dabbed that up with a paper towel, and it came right up. I didn't have any issues. So that's a good thing to know, because if you're anything like me, you probably make a lot of coloring errors. And with these watercolor pencils, it's very easily fixable. So I wanted my ground to be a little bit darker than it was. So I'm going to go in with a little bit darker of a brown and just kind of darken up those darkest areas. And again, going in with a damp paintbrush from the bottom up, meeting that pigment, just being super careful not to go over the actual image itself, because that area is still wet, especially on that boot. So I went ahead and just added a little bit of more color to the sole of the boot and spread that out. Let my panel dry completely. Again, you can certainly use a heat gun. I already had quite a bit of warping because of the background that I had created, and I probably should have taped it down before doing that, but I didn't. So I have a lot of warping, so I prefer to let this air dry and avoid any additional warping. Once it was dry, I'm going to go ahead and bring out my Misty. Because this is textured paper, it's just easier for me to bring out my Misty. That way I can double or triple stamp if needed. I'm lining up one of the sentiments from the Perfect Sentiment stamp set, also by Honeybee Stamps. I'm going to try to hold down my paper with that magnet because it is really, really, really warped. Going to end up stamping this twice, and I am using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a pigment ink. It is a fast drying pigment ink, but it does not dry immediately, but it does give you a really nice crisp image. You just will want to make sure that you clean your stamp immediately. So once that was dry, I am going to trim down my panel just a little bit on either side and a little bit on the top. I didn't take any off the bottom just because I didn't want to take any of my ground away. I did have a little bit of an issue trimming this down because it was so warped. It just wasn't laying flat in my paper trimmer. But once I finally got that, I am going to pop this up with some fun foam onto an A2 size top folding white note card. And I'm not trying the ATG gun. If you saw my previous video, you know I've had tons of issues with that. So I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue, stick the fun foam to the back of my card panel, and then stick that onto my card base. I place this under my Misty because you can see I have a ton of warping. That way it will lay flat while that glue sticks and dries. But that is the card for today, guys. I will list all of the supplies, and don't forget about the discount code to the Not Too Shabby shop. Bye, guys.